Ancient cities thrived for centuries without walls or gates. They were governed by powerful, unseen forces. We are exploring the invisible borders that defined space, identity, and power. These were not lines on a map, but boundaries woven from social codes, sacred beliefs, and economic ties. You will learn how these hidden systems created order and control, shaping the lives of millions. How did a society maintain its structure without a single physical barrier to hold it together? And what surprising truths about our own world lie buried in these ancient rules? What does it truly mean to belong to a place? The air in the ancient marketplace is thick with the scent of exotic spices and the clamor of a dozen different languages. A trader from a distant land haggles over the price of silk, his coins accepted without question. He moves freely through the crowd, yet he would never think to ascend the grand staircase to the temple precinct or wander into the quiet, shaded lanes of the elite residential quarter. No wall stops him, no guard turns him away. His path is shaped by something far more pervasive, an invisible border. An invisible border is a non-physical boundary enforced by culture, tradition, law, or belief that dictates exactly who can go where and how they should behave. As the historian Joseph Rickworth observed, the city is above all a representation, a visible shape of human order. These intangible lines could be more powerful and enduring than any stone wall, shaping urban life for generations. They function through a powerful collective agreement, a form of social pressure and deeply ingrained worldview that everyone simply understood. Consider the concept of ritual purity in many ancient societies. Certain spaces, like inner temples or springs dedicated to deities, were entirely off-limits to people based on their gender, social class, or even their profession. This was not enforced by a squad of soldiers at the door. It was enforced by a universal societal consensus, a shared belief that crossing that line would bring divine displeasure or social ostracization. The penalty for transgression was not just a fine, but a profound sense of shame and exclusion from the community itself. How did these abstract concepts manage to command such universal respect and adherence? The answer lies woven into the very fabric of ancient belief systems, where the spiritual and the social were one and the same. To understand the city, you must first understand these unseen rules that gave it meaning, rules that divided the sacred from the profane, the elite from the common, and the insider from the outsider. This silent, universal agreement was the true architecture of power. That shared belief in a sacred order was the silent architect of the city's plan. A priest in ancient Mesopotamia would spend nights observing the slow dance of the stars, not for curiosity, but for a divine blueprint. By aligning a temple's foundation precisely with a constellation or the path of the sun, he was not merely building a structure. He was drawing a border with cosmic ink, separating the sacred from the profane in a single, decisive act. This was sacred geography, the practice of mapping the divine onto the physical landscape. For ancient peoples, as the historian of religion Mircea Eliade noted, space was not all the same. Most of the world was ordinary, what he called profane. But certain locations held a different, heavier quality. They were sacred, ruptures in the ordinary world where the divine broke through. These points of contact created a powerful, invisible grid of meaning across the city and the surrounding land. A spring could be the home of a nymph. A grove of ancient trees might be the dwelling place of a god. A mountain peak could be the throne of a deity. These were not just pretty places, they were active, charged territories. The most potent of these zones were often marked by temples or shrines, but the boundary itself was not the stone wall surrounding them. The boundary was the spiritual force field the wall merely represented. To cross from the bustling market into the sacred precinct, the temenos of a Greek city, was to step into another realm entirely. It required ritual purification, perhaps a washing of the hands or a specific prayer. You did not just walk in, you transitioned, and to violate that border, to enter in a state of impurity or with ill intent, was not a simple social mistake. It was a transgression against the gods themselves, an act that risked bringing divine wrath upon the entire community. This spiritual framework did more than just guard temples. It orchestrated the rhythm of daily life. Great festivals and public processions were not random parades. They were deliberate journeys that traced these invisible lines of power through the urban fabric, moving from one sacred node to another, physically walking the community through its own divine map. In this way, the power of the gods became the ultimate enforcer of social order, providing a cosmic justification for who belonged where and why. But if the gods dictated the highest boundaries, what about the earthly hierarchies that governed life on the ground? Another invisible force was at work, one just as powerful and just as divisive. A nobleman's toga, woven with a broad purple stripe, was more than a fashion statement. It was a moving wall. In the same crowded Roman street, the patrician in his distinctive dress and the plebeian in his simple tunic existed in parallel dimensions, separated by an imperceptible yet unyielding social barrier. If sacred geography drew borders from the heavens, then social hierarchy built its own walls from human tradition, walls that were just as real and just as confining. These were the unseen architectures of class and caste, perhaps the most pervasive invisible borders of all. They dictated where you could live, what work you could do, who you could marry, and even how you spoke. In ancient India, the framework was the system of varna, often translated as caste. This was not a mere class system, but a cosmic and social blueprint. Your birth into a specific varna, whether Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra, determined your entire life's path, your duty, your spiritual status, and your place in the community. This was a border you could not cross. It was endogamous, meaning you married within your own group, ensuring the lines remained sharp and unchanging for generations. The philosopher Aristotle saw this differentiation as the very essence of the city. He argued that a polis is a compound of different kinds of men, and that like any compound, its stability relied on the distinct properties of its parts, not mixing indiscriminately. This idea of inherent difference was the intellectual justification for a world of separate spheres. But how were these abstract hierarchies enforced in the gritty reality of daily life? The answer lies in a web of visible and invisible controls. Sumptuary laws were a common tool, detailed regulations that dictated who could consume what. In Rome, laws specified the exact width of the purple stripe on a senator's toga, the type of jewelry a woman could wear, or the extravagance of a family's funeral. These were not mere fashion police. They were a constant, visible reminder of the social ladder, making status instantly legible and transgressions instantly obvious. A plebeian aspiring to a patrician's lifestyle was not just being ambitious. He was challenging the fundamental order of the universe. Beyond clothing, these borders were policed by restrictions on marriage, on access to certain priesthoods, and on participation in political assemblies. A Shudra in ancient India knew they could not perform a Vedic ritual reserved for Brahmins, just as a common Roman citizen knew the inner circles of senatorial power were off limits. This system was reinforced every day through etiquette, language, and the very layout of the city. The wealthy lived on the Palatine Hill in Rome, while the poor crowded into the cramped subura. They might pass each other in the forum, but they returned to entirely separate worlds at night. The fear that kept these borders intact was not of a soldier's spear, but of something far more potent: social ostracism and the terror of divine retribution for upsetting the established order. These invisible walls of class were as defining as any stone fortification, yet they left no physical trace for archaeologists to uncover. They were built and maintained in the human mind, a testament to the power of belief to shape reality itself. But what happens when belief is not enough, and the system needs a more tangible way to control the flow of people, goods, and ideas? Another form of invisible border emerged, one that governed the very lifeblood of the city, its economy. The Athenian agora hummed with a different kind of order, one dictated by the flow of commerce. To the untrained eye, it was a chaotic sea of barter and debate, but every merchant and customer navigated a strict, unwritten map. The fishmongers gathered in one specific corner, their stalls slick with seawater. A short walk away, the Munuchangers sat at their trapezoid tables, their voices a low murmur of calculation, separate from the haggling over pottery and textiles. This was a regulated frontier where economic activity created its own invisible borders. These lines dictated where certain trades could operate, who was permitted to participate, and the intricate rituals of how goods were exchanged. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded a stunning example from ancient Egypt, where trades like pottery or weaving were strictly hereditary. A son inherited not just his father's skill, but his entire economic territory, an invisible boundary of profession that was as difficult to cross as a mountain range. In Greece and Rome, this regulation was often managed by guilds and merchant associations. A leatherworkers' guild, for instance, would control who could set up a shop, how goods were priced, and the standards of quality. To operate outside this sanctioned circle was to risk being shut out of the market entirely, a form of economic exile. The Roman Forum was a masterclass in this segmentation. It was not one open square but a collection of specialized zones. The bustling Forum Boreum for cattle stood apart from the Grand Forum Romanum for politics and justice. Each area had its own norms, its own unspoken rules of conduct. You did not shout political speeches in the meat market, just as you did not haggle over the price of a cow in the Senate's shadow. How were these economic borders enforced? Not with guards, but with the powerful tools of custom and collective agreement. Merchant groups practiced price fixing, creating a unified front that outsiders could not penetrate. Access to the most valuable commodities like silk from China or incense from Arabia was often restricted to those within trusted social or ethnic networks. Even the very concept of money created a stark divide. Possessing coinage that stamped and guaranteed piece of metal granted you entry into a more sophisticated world of trade. Those reliant on simple barter, exchanging a chicken for a sack of grain, remained on the other side of an economic chasm. The flow of wealth carved these channels through the city as distinctly as any physical canal, directing the currents of daily life and ensuring a fragile, necessary stability. Yet for all their power, these invisible structures of belief, class, and commerce were not always enough to contain the sheer diversity of a thriving metropolis. When people from 100 different backgrounds were thrown together, how did the city decide who truly belonged? The house of a clan elder was more than a home. It was the living heart of a territory defined by blood. In an Iron Age village, the landscape was a patchwork of these invisible domains. Each cluster of dwellings, each plot of land, was claimed not by a fence but by lineage, a story of ancestors that stretched back generations. Your identity, your protection, and your place in the world were all rooted in the kinship group you were born into. This was the most primal form of urban organization, a city built not of districts but of families. In Rome, this unit was the gens, a powerful clan like the Julii or the Cornelii. Each gens maintained its own sacred rites, worshipped its own ancestral spirits, and held its own section of the city as a birthright. The authority of the clan elder, the paterfamilias, was absolute within this sphere, a domestic law that governed everything from marriage to property disputes. The city, in its earliest form, was essentially a confederation of these family states, a fragile alliance under a king or council. The anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan saw this kinship principle as the bedrock of ancient society, the original blueprint for order long before kings and bureaucrats. These clan borders were fiercely maintained. Endogamy, the practice of marrying within the group, was a primary tool, ensuring that land and loyalty remained concentrated. Shared economic activities like a clan specializing in metalworking or pottery further cemented their collective identity and control over a specific trade. And when conflict arose, it was the clan that provided defense, not an abstract city guard. A dispute between two clans would create a tense, unmarked frontier right down a city street. To cross from the territory of one clan into another without cause was not just trespass, it was a challenge to their collective honor, an insult that could spark a feud lasting for generations. The city was a mosaic of these family domains, each with its own internal rules, its own sacred burial grounds, and its own patron deities watching over its people. This tribal logic, this deep-seated need to belong to a lineage, was a force so powerful it could shape the geography of a metropolis for centuries. Yet, even the strongest blood ties could be challenged by a new kind of identity, one forged not by ancestry, but by a shared idea of what it meant to be a citizen. The voice of the crier echoes across the sun-baked square, each word a chisel carving order from chaos. In ancient Babylon, the public reading of Hammurabi's code was not just an announcement, it was the drawing of a line. The law itself became the most precise architect of invisible borders, meticulously defining domains of authority and spheres of permissible action for every level of society. A legal code did not merely list crimes and punishments, it spatially organized the entire city, specifying where certain legal procedures had to occur, who had the right to own property in which districts, and what constituted a violation of another's domain. Think of the 12 tables in Rome. These laws explicitly stated that a road must be 8 feet wide where it was straight and 16 feet wide on a curve. This was not simple traffic management. It was a legal border dictating the use of space, a state-mandated invisible line between public right-of-way and private property. The law created distinct zones of legal status, sacred space, private property, public land, and each came with its own set of inviolable rules. Your rights changed depending on which invisible zone you stood in. Perhaps the most profound example was the Roman Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. This was not a wall or a trench, but a religious and legal line, ceremonially blessed and marked by stones. Inside the Pomerium, the military power of a commander, his imperium, was suspended. No soldier could bear arms within this sacred space, and no army could cross it. To lead legions across this line was not an act of logistics. It was the gravest political crime, a direct assault on the Republic itself. The law, enforced by magistrates and courts, gave these abstract borders teeth. A magistrate's lictor carrying the fasces did not just symbolize power, he physically represented the reach of legal authority, a moving personification of the border. Yet the true power of these legal maps lay not in the threat of punishment. but in their legitimacy and widespread acceptance by the populace. People internalized these rules, knowing instinctively that the rules of conduct in the forum were different from those in a back alley, and that a neighbor's property line, even if unmarked, was a legal frontier as real as any mountain range. This intricate legal framework was the silent, meticulous administrator of every street and square. But what happens when these carefully drawn legal and social maps are challenged by the most fundamental force of all, the human need to move and connect? Walk through the bustling streets of ancient Alexandria, and the very air would change around you. The guttural sounds of Egyptian would give way to the melodic flow of Greek, then shift again to the sharp consonants of Aramaic or the unfamiliar rhythms of Nubian tongues. Each language was a living wall, an audible border signaling the entrance into a different world. In these sprawling, polyglot metropolises, linguistic and ethnic enclaves carved the city into a mosaic of invisible nations. Language was far more than a tool for communication. It was a potent marker of identity, a shibboleth that instantly sorted the insider from the outsider. The Greek historian Thucydides observed this power firsthand, noting how dialect and accent could reveal not just a person's hometown, but their entire political allegiance and cultural worldview. To hear a different language was to know you had crossed a frontier, even if the street looked exactly the same. For immigrant communities, these enclaves were a sanctuary. Consider the Jewish diaspora quarters found in cities like Rome and Alexandria. Here, within a few city blocks, people could live their entire lives speaking Aramaic or Hebrew, following their own dietary laws and worshipping at their own synagogues. These neighborhoods were self-governed, with their own councils of elders who settled disputes and organized community life according to ancestral traditions. This created a city within a city, a distinct social universe operating by its own internal clock and its own invisible rules. The borders were maintained not by gates but by powerful social forces. Endogamy, the practice of marrying within the group, ensured that cultural knowledge and lineage remained intact generation after generation. Social pressure kept most people within the familiar confines of their own community, for venturing beyond it meant navigating a world where you were instantly marked as an outsider. Access to certain trades was often monopolized along ethnic lines, with skills and trade secrets passed down within families and closed networks. A Phoenician glassblower or a Carian mercenary belonged to a professional world that was also an ethnic world, creating an economic border that reinforced the cultural one. These enclaves were a paradox. They were a refuge, a place where a displaced people could preserve their identity against the overwhelming pressure of a dominant culture. Yet that very preservation created a barrier to full integration. The distinctness that provided safety and continuity also marked the community as separate, sometimes fostering suspicion or resentment from the wider population. The invisible border of language and custom was both a shield and a cage. It partitioned urban space through the sound of a voice, the cut of a garment, and the scent of a familiar meal cooking in a neighbor's home, proving that the most resilient borders are often those built not from stone, but from shared memory and a common tongue. A priestess in ancient Mesopotamia would not simply walk from her home to the temple. Her journey was a careful navigation of a hidden map, one where entire streets or market stalls might be zones of spiritual contamination to be avoided at all costs. This was the world governed by purity and pollution, a system of invisible borders so rigorous they could dictate the very path a person took through their own city. These rules turned urban space into a landscape of ritual risk and safety, where the fear of spiritual defilement was a more powerful deterrent than any armed guard. The anthropologist Mary Douglas revealed that ideas about dirt and pollution are never just about hygiene. They are fundamentally about order. Things deemed unclean are matter out of place, substances or people that transgress the sacred categories a society has built to make sense of its world. To be pure was to be in your proper place within the correct social and spiritual boundaries. To be polluted was to be dangerously out of place, a threat to the cosmic and social order. This created a web of temporary and permanent exclusions. In ancient Zoroastrianism, the corpse was considered a source of extreme pollution. This created a powerful taboo around cemeteries and the professions of those who handled the dead. Their work was necessary, but it placed them on the other side of a profound social and spatial divide, often forcing them to live on the outskirts of the community. In Vedic India and ancient Hebrew society, elaborate codes governed every aspect of life. A woman after childbirth, a person who had touched a dead body, or someone with a specific skin disease could be declared ritually unclean. This status was not a moral judgment but a temporary state of spiritual quarantine. It meant you could not enter the temple precincts. You might be restricted in whom you could touch or what food you could eat. Your very presence in a sacred space was considered a transgression that could invalidate rituals and anger the gods, bringing misfortune upon everyone. How do you police such a border? Not with soldiers, but with a deeply internalized fear of divine retribution and the stinging shame of social ostracism. The community itself became the enforcer, watching for any breach in the invisible wall. This world, you did not just protect temples, it regulated the most intimate moments of life, from birth to death, turning the entire city into a living, breathing organism whose health depended on everyone staying in their ritually designated place. The threshold of a wealthy Greek home was a frontier as real as any city gate. Step inside and the air grew quieter, the light more private. A male guest would be received in the andron, the men's dining room, a space dedicated to symposiums and political debate. But just beyond, separated by a simple corridor, lay the gynekonitis, the women's quarters. This was an invisible wall built not of stone, but of custom, honor, and a deeply ingrained social code. The entire ancient world was crisscrossed by these gendered borders, silent yet powerful rules that dictated where men and women could exist, shaping the very rhythm of daily life. The public sphere, the bustling agora, the rowdy assembly, the marching army, these were overwhelmingly male territories. Here, citizenship, commerce, and power were negotiated. The domestic sphere, by contrast, was the woman's acknowledged domain, the heart of the household's economic and social life. In Rome, this division was codified in the authority of the paterfamilias, the male head of household. His power was absolute within the private world of the home, a realm that was, by custom, largely inaccessible to unrelated men. This was not merely a suggestion, it was a boundary enforced by social expectation and family reputation. A respectable woman appearing unescorted in the wrong part of the forum was not just breaking a rule, she was transgressing a fundamental, invisible line, risking gossip that could damage her family's standing. The reverse was also true. A man who lingered too long in the interior, female-dominated spaces of the home might be mocked for being unmanly or shirking his public duties. These divisions were literally built into the architecture. Wealthy homes were designed with separate courtyards, distinct entrances, and specific rooms that channeled movement according to gender. You did not need a sign to know you were crossing from one zone to another. The very design of the space guided you, reinforcing the social order with every step and every closed door. This pervasive separation was one of the most universally recognized organizing principles of ancient life, an intangible grid that governed behavior from the grandest temple to the most humble dwelling. proving that the walls that matter most are often the ones you cannot see. A family gathering at a roadside tomb in Rome was doing far more than honoring their dead. They were performing an act of territorial magic. With each offering of wine and each whispered prayer, they were reinforcing an invisible border, a claim to that piece of land that was recognized by the entire community not because of a legal deed, but out of a deep collective respect for the ancestors. This was the power of memory and ancestral veneration, a force that could etch property lines into the very soul of a place. The ghosts of the past became the most vigilant guardians of space. In Rome, this belief was embodied by the lares, the household gods. These were not distant, abstract deities. They were the divine spirits of the family's ancestors, protectors of the hearth, the stored food, and the property's boundaries. Their small shrine stood at the crossroads of the family's land, a constant, tangible reminder that this space was watched over by generations of the dead. To violate this border, to build on a neighbor's field, or even worse, to desecrate an ancestral tomb, was an act of profound sacrilege. It was not merely a legal offense, it was an attack on the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, and it risked bringing misfortune upon the entire neighborhood. How could a mere story hold such power over a physical space? The answer lies in the creation of memory maps. Every community was woven through with oral traditions and myths that attached to specific locations. That gnarled oak tree was where the city's founder first received a sign from the gods. That spring was where a nymph gave birth to a hero. That particular rock in the field was where a great-grandfather had made a pact with a neighbor. These were not just tales for entertainment. They were the legal and spiritual archives of a pre-literate society. They created anchors of identity, turning anonymous geography into a landscape thick with meaning and precedent. To ignore these stories, to plow over that sacred rock or build a shop on a legendary battlefield, was to spit on the community's shared history. It was socially unacceptable, an act of such profound disrespect that it could make you an outcast. The community's collective memory, passed down through generations, was the ultimate surveyor and enforcer. It remembered whose family had always tended that land, which clan had burial rights to that hillside, and which grove was too sacred for anyone to cut down. This deep historical layer gave the city's invisible fabric a permanence that stone walls could never achieve, proving that the most enduring borders are those drawn not on parchment, but in the stories we tell about the places we call home. For the Egyptian priest, the annual flood of the Nile was not a disaster but a divine necessity, erasing the old world to make way for the new. As the waters receded, leaving behind a blank slate of rich black silt, his task began. He would spend nights on a high platform, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting for the heliacal rising of the star Sirius. The moment its brilliant light pierced the pre-dawn sky was the signal. It was time to redraw the land. With cords and stakes, he would re-establish the boundaries of the temple lands, not according to a human map, but by aligning them with this celestial event. He was not merely measuring property, he was weaving the earthly city back into the fabric of the cosmos. This was the ultimate expression of sacred geography, the belief that a city's layout must mirror the celestial order to ensure its harmony and survival. Across the ancient world, this cosmic blueprint dictated urban design. Mesopotamian ziggurats were not random mounds of brick, they were stairways to heaven, their corners often precisely aligned with cardinal directions, and their levels representing the layered universe itself. To ascend the ziggurat was to cross a series of invisible borders, moving symbolically from the earthly plane through the planetary spheres toward the realm of the gods. The Chinese practice of feng shui, with its ancient roots, operated on a similar principle. It sought to align cities, tombs, and homes with the invisible flows of energy, or Kai, in the landscape. positioning them in harmony with mountains and waterways to harness beneficial forces and block malignant ones. These alignments were not just symbolic art, they were believed to have tangible life or death consequences for the city's inhabitants. A street aligned with the solstice sunrise might channel the sun's revitalizing power into the heart of the community for that one sacred day. A district positioned against the flow of earthly energy, however, could be seen as cursed, a place of misfortune and ill health. To cross from one of these cosmologically defined zones to another was to move between different levels of spiritual potency. The grand processional way in a Babylonian city was not just a road, it was the terrestrial echo of the path of the god Marduk through the heavens. Walking it during a festival was a ritual act of cosmic navigation. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars thus projected a living, breathing grid of invisible power onto the urban plan, a constant, silent reminder that the city's true borders were drawn not on earth but in the heavens. The hoplite's shield, emblazoned with the owl of Athena, was more than a piece of armor, it was a portable homeland. His true border was not the walls surrounding Athens, but the very idea of being Athenian, a political and cultural identity that separated him completely from a Spartan, even if they stood in the same marketplace. This was the power of the city-state, the Greek polis or Roman civitas, a form of organization that drew its most critical frontier not in the dirt but in the human heart. Citizenship was the ultimate invisible border, a legal and social status that conferred a world of rights and duties, creating an unbridgeable gap between the insider and the outsider, even when they lived side by side within the same city walls. In his famous funeral oration, the Athenian leader Pericles did not praise the city's fortifications, but its unique spirit, its constitution, and its way of life. He was describing an invisible citadel, one built from shared myths, collective participation in festivals, and a common commitment to the laws. This civic identity was so potent it made physical defenses almost secondary. A resident alien in Athens, a metic, could live there his entire life, speak flawless Greek, and contribute to the economy, yet he remained permanently on the wrong side of that line. He could not own land, he could not vote in the assembly, and he could not marry a citizen's daughter without special permission. His children, born and raised in the city, would inherit his status, forever outsiders in the only home they had ever known. This border was maintained through powerful rituals of belonging. The great Panathenaic festival, with its majestic procession carrying a new robe for the statue of Athena, was not just a religious event. It was a massive, public rehearsal of what it meant to be Athenian, physically walking the shared sacred geography that defined their collective identity. Participation in the assembly, where every citizen had the right to speak, was another powerful reinforcer of this exclusive club. The strength of this civic bond created a community that was territorially fluid, its influence and identity radiating far beyond its physical acropolis, yet culturally bounded to an extreme degree. It was an abstract line, but it was the most fiercely defended border of all, for to cross it was to change not where you lived, but who you were. The Tiber River sliced through the heart of Rome like a flowing legal document. Its currents marked a boundary far more significant than its muddy banks, separating the city proper with its sacred Pomerium from the Janiculum Hill on the opposite shore. To cross the river was to cross a frontier of power, leaving the domain of civilian law and entering a space where military authority held sway. Waterways were the original, fluid frontiers of the ancient world, natural features that doubled as powerful invisible borders, carrying immense legal, economic, and symbolic weight. In Egypt, the Nile was the central artery of all existence, yet its east and west banks held profoundly different spiritual meanings. The rising sun associated the east bank with life, rebirth, and the realm of the living, while the setting sun cast the west bank as the domain of the dead, the location for vast necropolises like those at Thebes. A ferry ride across the river was not just a change of scenery, it was a ritual transition from one cosmic state to another. This symbolic division was mirrored in practical governance. Rivers frequently demarcated the boundaries between tribes, city-states, or imperial provinces. Control over the points of crossing was where this invisible power became tangible. A bridge was not merely an engineering marvel, it was a choke point, a gatehouse on a liquid wall. The state could station tax collectors there, extracting tolls from every merchant and their goods, turning the flowing water into a hard economic border. A fordable section of a river might be fiercely guarded, its access granted or denied by local chieftains who controlled the invisible line it represented. Even the use of the water itself was a contested frontier. The right to draw water for irrigation, to cast a net for fish, or to moor a trading vessel was often a privilege strictly regulated by custom, law, or royal decree. In Mesopotamia, the intricate networks of canals were not just lifelines for agriculture. They also served as precise property boundaries and markers of administrative control, their man-made channels etching lines of ownership into the earth as clearly as any stone wall. Can a border truly be a border if it is always moving? These liquid frontiers were uniquely dynamic, shifting with seasons, floods, and droughts, requiring constant negotiation and reaffirmation. A boundary stone on a riverbank could be washed away, forcing communities to rely on shared memory and oral tradition to remember where the invisible line had once been. This constant fluidity made water the most unpredictable and yet most essential of all the ancient world's invisible architects. The Stoa Poikile in Athens was more than a painted colonnade, it was a battleground of the mind. Here, beneath its famous murals, philosophers like Zeno gathered with their students, forging a territory defined not by stone, but by the relentless pursuit of wisdom. This was an intellectual borderland, a zone within the city where certain ideas were rigorously debated and others were systematically dismantled. Philosophical schools like Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum did more than teach. They established sovereign nations of thought, each with its own distinct doctrines, its own language, and its own invisible walls. To pledge allegiance to a school was to adopt a complete worldview, a lens through which to interpret everything from the nature of the gods to the proper conduct of daily life. A committed Stoic who believed in mastering destructive emotions through reason existed in a different mental universe from an Epicurean who sought a life free from pain and fear. This intellectual divide could create profound social borders. Your philosophical affiliation influenced who you associated with, who you trusted, and even who you considered a friend. Access to these exclusive circles was itself a form of border control. While some public lectures were open to all, the inner teachings of a school were often reserved for a select few, restricted by the need for prior knowledge, the right social connections, or a formal invitation from the master. The Epicurean garden was a perfect example of this principle made physical. It was not just a place to discuss philosophy, it was a self-contained community where followers could live together, separated from the hustle of Athenian life by a shared commitment to ataraxia, a tranquil state free from worry. These thought worlds were fiercely policed not by soldiers but through the sharp tools of logical debate, public criticism, and, when necessary, the ultimate penalty of exclusion from the group. To hold a heretical view was to risk being cast out from your intellectual homeland. The ancient city was thus a living mosaic of these competing and coexisting territories of the mind, proving that the most challenging borders to cross are often the ones we build with our own ideas. A bonfire roared at the center of the Celtic village, its flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to dissolve the edges of the known world. This was Samhain, the night when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, and with it, the invisible borders that governed every day simply vanished. The strict social hierarchies, the territorial claims of chieftains, even the fear of the haunted forest, all of it melted away in the firelight. For this one sacred night, the entire map was redrawn by time itself. This reveals a profound truth that the ancient city was not a static place, but a pulsating organism whose rules changed with the turning of the earth. The most powerful borders were not always permanent. They were often temporary, rising and falling with the rhythms of the clock and the calendar. These were the shifting frontiers of time. The agricultural year dictated the use of land in a constant, predictable cycle. A field might be the private, inviolable property of a single family during the growing season, its boundary stones respected by all. But once the harvest was gathered, that same field could transform into common land, open for the entire village to graze their livestock. The invisible wall around it did not crumble. It simply opened on a schedule everyone understood. This same temporal logic governed sacred spaces. A great temple, usually accessible only to purified priests, might throw its doors open to the entire populace during a major festival. For a few days, the rigid border separating the profane from the sacred was ceremonially dissolved, allowing every citizen to walk in the presence of the divine. But when the festival ended, the invisible barrier snapped back into place, more powerful than ever. The Romans perfected this with their official calendar, a complex temporal map of legal possibility. There were dies fasti, days when it was lawful to conduct business in the courts and the forum, and dies nefasti, days when such activities were forbidden by divine law. To file a lawsuit on a dies nefasti was not just a procedural error, it was a spiritual transgression. Even the setting sun could erect a formidable wall. In countless cities, the night brought a curfew, an invisible barrier of time that confined people to their homes. The darkened streets became a different realm, patrolled not by guards, but by the shared fear of what the darkness itself might conceal. To be caught outside after the bells tolled was to find yourself on the wrong side of a temporal frontier, a trespasser in your own city. This constant ebb and flow meant you could walk the same street at noon and at midnight and be crossing two entirely different sets of rules. The city you knew by day was not the city that existed under the stars. It was a place of many faces, its true shape revealed not in its stone but in its schedule. A deep bow in the imperial court of Heian, Japan was a precise measurement of social space. The exact angle of the torso, the duration of the held position, and the distance from the other person were not matters of polite preference. They were a rigid, invisible geometry of status and respect, a border drawn in the very air between two people. The human body itself was a territory, governed by its own intricate laws of etiquette, honor, and profound taboo. Your personal space was not an empty void, but a sacred extension of your social self. In Rome, a man's dignitas was not just his reputation, it was a tangible, almost magical aura that surrounded him. To violate this space, to jostle him in the street, or worse, to lay a hand upon him without permission, was not a simple accident. It was an assault on his public honor, an act that could demand satisfaction in the form of a lawsuit or even a duel. This invisible boundary was mobile, moving with the individual through the city, its size and inviolability shifting with their rank. A slave had no such protected space, their body subject to the touch and command of anyone above them. The rules of the body were a constant, silent negotiation. In many cultures, direct eye contact with a social superior was a brazen challenge. while averting your gaze was a sign of deference. To accidentally let your shadow fall upon a king or a high priest was considered a pollution of his sacred person, a transgression that could carry severe penalties. These micro-boundaries were learned from the earliest age, enforced not by law, but by the sharp sting of social censure, a disapproving glance, or a hissed word from a parent. They created a social harmony by meticulously regulating the most fundamental human interactions: touch, gaze, and proximity. The way you held your body, where you stood, and whom you could approach were all acts of navigation across an unseen social grid, a daily performance that reinforced the city's deepest hierarchies without a single word being spoken. The bronze bell's voice rolled across the rooftops, a wave of sound that washed over the entire city. This was not just a noise, it was a command, an audible order that everyone, from the noble in his villa to the slave in the street, instantly understood and obeyed. The ancient city was not just a place of sights but of sounds, a complex soundscape where bells, gongs, horns, and human cries carved the air into distinct acoustic territories. The Roman herald, the preco, did not merely shout news. His voice, trained to cut through the din of the forum, created a temporary sphere of authority. Everyone within earshot was compelled to pause, to listen, to become part of a single, informed public. His call did not need a wall to define its reach. It created its own border, a circle of shared attention that moved with him through the crowded streets. This principle governed the entire daily cycle. The trumpet blast from the citadel at dusk was not a suggestion. It was the sound of the city gate slamming shut, an invisible barrier of time and law that fell across every ear. From that moment, the rules of the night were in effect. The sound itself was the curfew. These acoustic markers created communities of listeners bound by a shared experience. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer or the steady whir of the potter's wheel did more than announce a craft. It painted an informal but unmistakable border around an entire industrial quarter. You knew you had entered the zone of the metalworkers not by a sign, but by the constant, percussive soundtrack that filled the air. Conversely, silence was its own powerful frontier. The great library of Alexandria or the inner sanctum of a temple were expected zones of profound quiet. To break that silence with a loud voice or clattering steps was not merely rude, it was a transgression against an invisible rule, a violation of a sacred or intellectual space that could draw immediate censure. Perhaps the most profound example was the call to prayer. When a horn sounded from a Jewish temple or a chant rose from an Egyptian shrine, it did not just summon the faithful. It defined a sacred acoustic space, momentarily pulling the divine down into the noisy human world and marking everyone within hearing as part of a spiritual community. This intricate web of sound orchestrated the city's rhythm, creating a collective understanding of time, danger, and social order that was felt in the bones as much as heard by the ears. But if sound could build these invisible walls of community, what happened when the system itself was challenged from within, when someone deliberately crossed a line they were not supposed to see? Your nose would have known exactly where you were in the ancient city long before your eyes confirmed it. A sharp, acrid wave of ammonia and rotting organic matter meant you had entered the tannery district, an invisible wall of stench that kept all but the most necessary traffic at bay. This was an olfactory map, a border drawn not in stone but in scent, segregating urban space with a power more immediate than any written law. The pungent odors from trades like leather tanning, fish salting, and purple dye production created a sensory moat around entire neighborhoods. These smells were not just unpleasant side effects, they were active, functioning boundaries that dictated the flow of daily life and reinforced the social hierarchy with every breath. The wealthy and powerful consistently situated their villas on the upwind side of the city, ensuring the prevailing breezes carried the foul air of industry away from their gardens and into the quarters of the poor. Your address was quite literally a matter of air quality. This created a de facto class division as clear as any gate, where the luxury of clean, fragrant air was a privilege of status. Conversely, pleasant aromas created their own exclusive halos. The drifting smoke of sandalwood incense from a temple precinct marked it as a sacred space, its unique fragrance separating the holy from the profane as effectively as a towering wall. The delicate scent of perfumed oils wafting from a wealthy home's courtyard signaled an elite domesticity, an aromatic announcement of refinement and privacy that commoners were not meant to cross. Even Rome's great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, exerted its presence through a distinct, damp odor that defined the neighborhoods through which it flowed underground. These scent borders were so potent they often required official management. Many city councils passed regulations banishing the foulest industries, like tanning or fullering, beyond the city walls, actively using smell to redraw the urban perimeter. To walk from a perfumer's shop into a street of butchers was to cross a sensory frontier as real as a river, a journey guided by the most primal of senses, proving that the city's truest map was written on the air itself. A sideways glance from a neighbor could feel as sharp as a spear. In the dense, interconnected neighborhoods of the ancient world, you were never truly alone. The collective gaze of the community functioned as a permanent, informal surveillance system, a force that policed invisible borders with relentless efficiency. This was social control in its most intimate form, where the fear of gossip and the weight of shame kept everyone in their prescribed place. In a small Greek polis or a tightly knit Roman insula, anonymity was impossible. Your business was everyone's business. This constant mutual observation regulated the most minute aspects of life, the cut of your tunic, the tone of your voice in a dispute, even the frequency of a young man's visits to a certain house. Any deviation from the accepted norm was instantly noted, mentally recorded, and swiftly censured through a network of whispered judgments. The Greek ideal of eidos was the internal engine of this system. It was a profound sense of shame, a reverent fear of how your actions would appear in the eyes of others. A man of eidos did not need a law to tell him not to cheat a customer in the marketplace. The imagined disapproving stare of his peers was deterrent enough. He internalized the community's standards, carrying an invisible judge within his own mind. This internal compass was calibrated by the relentless currency of gossip. A damaged reputation was a form of social death. A merchant known for selling shoddy goods might find his stall suddenly empty of customers. A woman rumored to have broken marital codes could find herself excluded from the vital social networks of her peers. The punishment was not banishment from the city's gates, but from its heart, a chilling exile into silence and sidelong looks while still physically present among everyone you knew. This created a panopticon effect long before the concept had a name. It was the unsettling feeling that at any moment someone might be watching, judging, and talking. You never knew for certain if you were being observed, so you learned to behave as if you always were. The city itself became a living architecture of watchful eyes, its streets and squares a stage where every performance was for an audience that never closed. This decentralized, self-policing network was arguably more effective than any official guard force, proving that the most confining walls are often built from the fear of what people might say. A clay tablet in ancient Mesopotamia was more than an accountant's record. It was a prison without walls, etched with cuneiform figures tracking a debt of grain or silver. This simple object wove an invisible financial tether, a bond of obligation that could dictate the entire course of a person's life. Debt was not merely a number, it was a powerful, personal border that restricted economic movement and social freedom as effectively as any physical barrier. In many ancient societies, failure to repay what you owed did not just mean losing your property. It could mean losing your very self, plunging you into the state of debt bondage. This was a form of temporary slavery where you and your family labored for the creditor, your freedom suspended until the balance was settled. That debtor, even while walking the same streets as a free citizen, existed on the other side of an invisible line, barred from full participation in civic life, their choices and future held in someone else's hands. This system created a perilous slope where a single bad harvest or a failed business venture could erase a person's status, transforming a neighbor into a servant overnight. The potential for social collapse under the weight of these unbreakable chains was so great that radical solutions were devised. The Hebrew Bible's concept of the Jubilee year was a breathtaking social reset, a mandated event occurring every 50 years. At the sound of the ram's horn, all debts were to be forgiven and ancestral lands returned to their original families. This was a deliberate demolition of the financial borders that had stratified society, a forced restoration of a level playing field intended to prevent a permanent underclass from forming. Access to credit itself was a guarded frontier. If you lacked land or social standing, the gates of finance remained closed, locking you out of the opportunities for growth that your wealthier neighbors enjoyed. These intertwined relationships of lender and borrower wove a complex web of dependency and power throughout the entire city. Your net worth, the sum of your possessions minus your obligations, was one of the most decisive invisible lines of all. It determined who you could marry, what political alliances you could forge, and the volume of your voice in public debates. The silent, relentless flow of capital drew some of the most consequential and unforgiving maps of the ancient world. The master potter's hands, caked with dried clay, move with a rhythm known only to him. In his workshop in ancient Corinth, the recipe for the brilliant black glaze that makes his wares so prized is a secret more valuable than the coins he earns. That knowledge is a wall, an invisible border as real as any fortress, and it is guarded with a ferocity born of generational pride. This was the world of the professional guild, a powerful association where craft and lineage intertwined to create exclusive economic territories within the city. To be a member of the Potter's Guild was to possess a key to a walled garden, granting you access to everything from rare raw materials and specialized tools to the trusted clientele who would buy your goods. This membership was rarely a matter of simple choice. It was often hereditary, a trade passed from father to son, binding a family to a single profession for generations. For an outsider, the only way in was through a long and arduous apprenticeship, a years-long initiation where you paid for knowledge with your labor, slowly earning the trust needed to learn the guarded secrets at the craft's heart. The guild did more than just hoard knowledge, it actively policed its economic borders. It established strict standards of quality, ensuring that a Corinthian pot or a Roman sword carried a reputation for excellence that benefited every member. It set prices, preventing destructive internal competition and creating a unified front against outsiders. It regulated the number of workshops, controlling supply to maintain demand and protect the livelihoods of those inside the circle. To practice a trade without the guild's sanction was to cross a dangerous line. You would be denied access to communal resources, shunned by established merchants, and your goods might be publicly denounced as inferior or even cursed. The penalty was economic ostracism, a quiet but effective form of exile that could destroy a family. The guild hall itself stood as the physical heart of this invisible network, a place where deals were struck, disputes were settled, and the social bonds of the profession were reinforced over shared wine. These professional boarders served a vital purpose. They preserved high standards and ensured the careful transmission of complex skills across centuries. Yet that same protection came at a steep cost. They stifled social mobility, locking people into the trades of their ancestors. They could also suppress innovation, as any radical new technique or material threatened the established methods that defined the guild's identity. The city's economy became a patchwork of these protected enclaves, each with its own gatekeepers, its own secret handshakes, and its own invisible walls built not from stone, but from skill itself. A storyteller's voice, low and steady, could transform an ordinary cliff face into the frozen grief of a god. He would tell of a mighty deity shedding a single, petrifying tear, and from that moment the strange rock was no longer just stone. It was a sacred monument, forever set apart from the mundane fields surrounding it, its invisible border drawn not by a king's decree but by the power of a story. Myths and legends were the original cartographers, etching the landscape with a deep, narrative meaning that everyone understood and honored. The entire world became a storybook whose pages were written in hills, rivers, and groves. The founding myth of Rome did not merely explain its origins, it actively built the city's sacred geography. The story of Romulus and Remus established the Palatine Hill as a holy center, the umbilicus urbis, or navel of the city. The furrow Romulus plowed to mark the city's ritual boundary, the Pomerium, was not just a ditch, it was a line sanctified by divine will and fratricidal blood. To cross it improperly was to violate a story that was the very foundation of Roman identity. The land was thick with such charged locations. A cave might be the very spot where a hero entered the underworld. A lonely stretch of coast could be where a sea god first emerged from the waves. A particular spring was not just water, but the eternal weeping of a nymph betrayed. These were not just landmarks for navigation, they were landmarks for the soul, places that commanded universal acknowledgement. Some were to be venerated with offerings and prayers, while others were to be avoided entirely, their air heavy with taboo. To build a house upon a field where a god had battled a monster, or to plow a mound that local lore said covered an ancient hero's bones, was an act of profound disrespect. It was an affront to the collective memory of the community, a reckless stirring of powers no one fully understood. How were these story maps preserved across centuries, long before written histories? They lived in the rhythmic cadence of epic poetry recited at festivals. They were acted out in ritual reenactments and dramatic performances that made the past vividly present. They were carved into temple friezes and painted on the walls of wealthy homes, a constant visual reminder of the invisible lines that structured their world. Every generation learned the sacred topography from the last, internalizing a map where myth and reality were inseparable. The landscape became a living palimpsest, a parchment where each new layer of human activity had to contend with the older, divine stories etched beneath. This narrative layer gave the land a soul and a history that dictated its use far more effectively than any surveyor's chain ever could. The gleaming white marble of the Forum was a deliberate lie, a beautiful fiction of universal order. Just a few streets away, the reality of the city reasserted itself in the form of cramped, winding alleys of tamped earth and crumbling mud brick. This stark visual divide was not an accident of urban decay, but the physical manifestation of an aesthetic border, a silent but potent hierarchy written in stone, space, and light. The ruling classes understood that beauty itself could function as a tool of exclusion. By investing vast sums in paving central plazas with marble, erecting colonnaded walkways, and planting serene public gardens, they created islands of visual harmony and order. These spaces were not just pleasant to look at, they were declarations of power, civilization, and control. To walk there was to be reminded of the gulf between those who could command such refinement and those who could not. This aesthetic project created an informal geography of taste that perfectly mirrored the social ladder. The wealthy patrician on the Palatine Hill enjoyed a breathtaking vista of manicured gardens and ornate temple roofs from his villa. The plebeian in the Sumptuary looked out onto a tangled web of laundry lines and the soot-stained walls of his neighbors, a world deemed ugly, chaotic, and therefore morally suspect. The city's landscape became a sensory codebook. Your address was communicated through the very materials of your surroundings: marble and carved stone for the elite, wattle and daub and rough timber for the masses. This visual coding made social stratification instantly legible to everyone. You did not need to ask a man's status. You could simply look at the street he emerged from. When urban planning was applied, its primary goal was often to impose this geometric order on the city's heart, drawing a clear, invisible line between the civilized, monumental core and the seemingly disordered, organic periphery where the majority actually lived. To move from the splendid, open forum into a dark, narrow alley was to cross a frontier more real than any checkpoint. A journey from a world of curated privilege into one of raw struggle, all guided by the unspoken judgments of the human eye. That collective gaze could harden into something far more primal, a terror that made entire sections of the city vanish from daily use. On the crumbling outskirts of a Roman town, a grove of ancient, twisted trees stood silent. No law forbade anyone from entering, and no fence blocked the way. Yet the townspeople gave it a wide berth, their steps quickening as they passed. This was a forbidden zone, a place erased from the mental map by the sheer force of collective dread. Fear and superstition could erect barriers more absolute than any royal decree, carving voids into the urban fabric where nothing physical had changed. These psychological borders transformed ordinary locations into territories of the mind, places haunted not just by ghosts but by the memory of tragedy. A well where a child had drowned decades ago would be avoided forever, whispered to be cursed. A house where a brutal crime occurred would stand empty for generations, its story growing more grotesque with each retelling. An old battlefield, especially one where the dead were left unburied, was considered a landscape of restless spirits, a place no farmer would dare plow and no traveler would cross after dark. The origins of these fears were often rooted in real, traumatic events: a plague that wiped out a neighborhood, a massacre by an invading army, or a sudden landslide that buried a street. But as time passed, the raw historical fact was woven over with a richer, more terrifying layer of folklore. The plague became the wrath of a specific demon. The massacre was attributed to a phantom legion that still marched on moonless nights. These stories did not just explain the past, they actively policed the present. How did a simple rumor become an unbreakable social rule? The enforcement was intimate and relentless. Parents, wanting to protect their children, would issue stern warnings about the old temple or the lonely stretch of riverbank. These cautionary tales, passed from one generation to the next, solidified the taboo. The community collectively agreed to avoid these spots, and to be seen venturing into one was to mark yourself as either foolish, cursed, or dangerously outsider. This created a parallel geography of the city, a mental overlay of safe lanes and unsafe voids that everyone navigated instinctively. The actual, physical risk in these places was often negligible, but the perceived spiritual danger was overwhelming. The human capacity for storytelling and fear thus became a powerful, if invisible, urban planner, proving that the most impenetrable borders are those we build for ourselves, brick by terrifying brick, in the theater of our own mind. We have traveled through the intricate web of invisible borders that gave structure to ancient cities. From the sacred geographies of temples to the psychological frontiers of fear, from the rigid lines of social caste to the fluid boundaries of the marketplace. These unseen forces, law, memory, economy, and belief, were the true architects of urban life, proving that the most powerful walls are often those we cannot see. They show us that human societies have always relied on abstract concepts to create order, belonging, and meaning. As we navigate our own modern world of digital borders and social networks, the lessons of these ancient systems remain profoundly relevant, reminding us that community is built as much on shared ideas as on shared space. The next time you walk through a city, remember that you are traversing a landscape shaped by countless invisible histories. If this exploration of the past has illuminated the present for you, consider subscribing for more journeys into history's hidden layers, and share your thoughts on which invisible borders you see at work in our world